Hello there. My name's Sir Aaron, and today I'd like to talk to you about a new project that I've got in the works this year. I've been playing tabletop role-playing games for most of my life at this point, and have been running them as a GM for almost as long. In that whole time, I have probably never run a tabletop role-playing game completely raw, as they say, rules as written. I've always been hacking things and taking rules from other games and snipping them into my games, and always thinking of new ways of running games and designing little things and making hacks and modules, which I think is something that every GM does to some degree. But this year I decided that I think I have enough good ideas and enough experience from playing and running so many other games that I want to give making my own tabletop role-playing game system a shot. I've done this before, technically. About 4 years ago, I made a little system called Distant Worlds, but I never publicly released it. It was good enough at the time, but a lot of my design philosophies and the way that I run and play games has changed, and I don't really see any point in trying to edit what I had originally written for Distant Worlds into something that I would now want to play. I think it's better to just start over. It can be hard to make a game in a vacuum, though, and in many ways this system will be a response to a lot of what I don't like about tabletop role-playing games at the moment. And there's so much competition out there, so many other games, that it might be difficult for me to convince other people to want to play my game. But that's okay, because I'll actually be releasing this game for free. My primary design goal with this project is to make a game that I want to play, or to make a game that I want to run and that my players will enjoy playing. That means that once that design goal is fulfilled, I sort of don't care what else happens to the game. So I figure I might as well release it for free. Not only that, but I'm a big proponent of the free and open source movement in software. And I thoroughly believe that the tabletop role-playing space or industry is one that has a long and proud history of hacking games together. It is very difficult to make money in the tabletop role-playing industry unless you are Wizards of the Coast or another big publisher. Independents can make good products. In fact, they do make amazing products, but very few independents make their own systems. Part of the reason because of that, I think, is because of the lack of open or easily licensed game engines. There are a few options available if you want to write RPG books without trying to pitch your idea to a large license holder. You could make OGL content, that is, the Open Game License, and its related genre of games, such as is often termed the Old School Renaissance, or OSR. But if you're not a fan of that particular sort of game engine, which I flip-flop over whether I like it or not, then your other options are quite limited as well. There's the Powered by the Apocalypse system, there's Blades in the Dark. There are a few smaller Creative Commons licensed games, but many of them are either currently lacking active development or are kind of lost and forgotten. On top of that, none of the other games have a core game engine that actually appeals to me. I'm not a great fan of the way that Powered by the Apocalypse works, for example. Just personal preference. So, I want to make a game that I want to play, but I also want that game to be as easily accessible as possible to anyone else who may be interested in it. That means that when the game releases, there will be a free version available. That means that once I have the version of the game that I want to play, I'm happy to release almost all of the content into the public domain, not just Creative Commons. And that means that, with the exception of the requirement to buy a few funny-shaped dice, and for the moment, the requirement to understand the English language, there should hopefully be as few barriers to entry as possible for anybody who's interested in either playing or designing for this game. And with that in mind, for the purpose of being as open and transparent about my design process, I want to try and make little videos like this, or possibly live streams every week, to just sort of show you where I'm up to and what I'm thinking about. That way, if anyone comes to the system and decides they want to start designing for it, they can scrub back through these videos and see if they can work out what I was thinking and see if they can make adjustments that are appropriate to the system. So this will be a free and open source tabletop role-playing game, you could say, that anyone can contribute to, and anyone can use the core game engine, which will be called the Venus engine, without permission. So, aside from wanting to make a game that I want to play, I have a few other design goals in mind. I want the system to be relatively versatile and scalable to most of the sorts of settings and situations that I run, especially within my own world-building project. That means that in order to be that versatile, the game will require some front end of complexity. The character creation process will be quite in-depth, I think, compared to other games at least. And character creation as a whole is probably something that would take up at least the first session of play. But I want it to be fun, so I do want it to be a session of play in which you create your characters. But then, for the actual gameplay, I want there to be relatively low or comparatively low complexity. The rest of the game should be able to handle most situations once you've got your character fully fleshed out. The main focus of this game will be on different kinds of conflict resolution. I think that ultimately, in a role-playing game, everything that could have a mechanic tied to it is an abstraction of something that can happen in the real world. Or in the case of fantastical technologies or magics, something that is believable within a realistic setting. Those mechanics are something that I find very interesting, and I have a lot of fun designing. But mechanics are only useful in a role-playing game if they allow the players to take actions that have interesting consequences, or which present choices that result in memorable storytelling or narrative experiences. At the very core of every role-playing game is a desire, I think, to tell stories. There's a lot of writing on this topic, and I won't get into the nitty-gritty of it, but I do think, to some degree or another, that the role-playing culture is an extension of our most ancient form of oral tradition. So, that's another reason why I want to make the system free and open source, because I think that ultimately this game will just be a set of tools that anyone should or could be able to use to tell their own stories and to collaborate on stories with their friends. The system will also be modular. That means that there will be mechanics that you can pull out and replace with something else that you've designed or that someone else has designed, or potentially removed completely and forgotten about. Or, in some cases, there may be mechanics that aren't granular enough for your use case, and in those cases you could design a sub-mechanic and add that on as well. So my goal is to try to playtest often, at least every 2 weeks if I can, and start with the simplest version of the game that I've made, and then see through play where I feel that that granularity is missing, and then add something that I want, that I think will be sufficient to plug that hole with, basically. So I do have some ideas. I have a full outline of what I want the final game to more or less look like, but I'm also open to things going wrong and finding out that something that I think was going to work won't work, or whatever else it might be. But I've been designing games long enough that I think I know what I want. And with that regular playtesting in mind, that also means I want to get a playable public version out, at least a sort of alpha or beta version out, within a month or two. So, in a few minutes, I will sort of run you through some of my core philosophies of design and show you a bit of the outline. But I thought it would be fun to just start by explaining what the core mechanics of this system is, or of the game engine will be, if I had to pigeonhole it and put it on rpggeek.com. So this game, which will be called Evening Star, and which will be running on the Venus engine, will have two types of resolution. It will have a standard D20 resolution called a check, and a dice pool resolution system using D10s called a task. It will have a life path type character generation system where you have sort of vocations to choose from that your character has pursued at various points throughout their life, and that creates a set of skills and attributes that you then have like a point buy system from. It will have individual skill learning and advancement, so each skill will have its own level that you independently advance from each other skill that you have. And it will have trait or aspect-based gameplay, where different features of your character can contribute in small ways to build up the whole. There will be a descriptive or narrative focus, but I'm hoping the game will be versatile enough to run traditional turn-based combat scenarios, as well as perhaps even social debates or chase scenes or any number of other interesting action moments. And hopefully it will also have a wagering mechanic using metacurrencies to basically make narrative stakes during gameplay. So, this is the outline. I'm currently basically just writing this in Visual Studio Code using a markdown file because it's the thing that I just happened to start typing in when I started getting ideas about this. But ultimately, I actually think using markdowns might be a good idea for the SRD, at least. Probably not for a full, big, shiny release, but for a wiki-style reference document, markdown files are actually quite useful because you can link them together. And there's a nice application out there called Obsidian, and there's a few others, which will show you like link trees and stuff for all your markdown files to basically create this like visual wiki. So I'm going to be looking into that. It also makes version control a lot easier because markdown files are very small, and I can just put these up on GitHub and anyone can like fork the project or make pull requests, changes, whatever they want. So I'll just talk through some of this outline in brief to give you an idea of where I'm headed and what I'm thinking about with this game. First of all, there's a bit of style guide stuff for when I actually start writing. I want to use the second person pronoun you to refer to the reader at all times and just let the context of the sentence determine whether you means the GM, the player, or their character. I want to introduce the concept of different session types. I think this is something that's missing in a lot of other games where there is just one kind of session. It is gameplay. And there's very little discussion in the rules themselves. There's a lot of discussion about different session types online, but there's very often very little discussion in the game itself about different modes of play. And so that's something I want to talk about in this game. I want there to be normal gameplay sessions, which is what you would expect from a role-playing game. But those normal sessions will also be broken into segments. A preamble segment at the very beginning of the session, your normal gameplay moments, the metagame, which is very important to me as another feature of the game that everyone should be interested in at all times. Like, the metagame is part of the game and is worth playing, so to speak. And then also the debriefing, where after the session, or as the last sort of 15 minutes of the session, you go over what happened. In the same way, in the preamble, you recap what happened last time and sort of get prepared for what's going to happen this session. But aside from normal gameplay, I also want there to be some discussion about other kinds of sessions. So downtime sessions, when you use when a lot of time passes and you can use that time to sort of do some training or have little role-playing scenes and earn some experience points. I want there to be some more aid to GMs who run solo sessions. Personally, I really enjoy running solo sessions, but as a GM, as someone who reads a lot of other role-playing games, there's very little advice, again, in the games themselves offered to people that play solo. I should say that's solo meaning one GM and one player rather than a game that you just play by yourself. This won't be that kind of game, unfortunately. Then I also want there to be development sessions, which Session 0, as it's sometimes called, would be an example of, where you gather everyone together, you sit down at the appropriate session time, and you start to talk about what your campaign is going to be about. You set the tone, you set the expectations, and you start making characters. I want development sessions to be something that you can come back to. There's been a number of times when I've had to do a re-session 0, or a session 0.2, or a session 0.3 in some cases, and where you kind of have these long discussions with your players about where the game is headed and whether they're still happy with what's going on and if they want to make changes to their characters. This is something that happens regularly enough in my games that I feel that session 0 is an inadequate word to cover the sorts of things that can happen in a development session. There's some stuff here about the system itself. This is basically just talking about the sort of target number, roll a d20, add your ability points, try and pass a certain target with your roll. That's the check. And then the task is for more complicated verbs, whereas the check is for simple verbs. There's a few reasons for wanting to include two different types of resolution mechanics in this game. I'm aware that it does complicate the game quite substantially in some cases, but it allows an opportunity to really make every roll count. I find that games that only have effectively checks are never granular enough, and because of the uniform probability distribution of rolling a d20, you end up with some very swingy results, and so it's hard to pin a high narrative stake on a single dice roll with a check. But checks are also very quick, they're very handy, and they're fun. So there's definitely a place for checks in my game. And the first few playtests, I want to run the game using only checks, actually. Because I know that this works, right? Rolling a d20 and adding stuff to it is a very time-honored mechanic. But for more complicated verbs, where the narrative stakes are higher, I think a dice pool system is the best thing out there, really. It has a much more complicated probability distribution, something that is probably not even worth getting into the details of, at least not right now. But with the dice pool system, it makes the addition of each new dice to the pool as you build up your skill, and you get help and you get other advantages, and you're working up to this moment, and there's a massive payoff when you succeed or fail, and you get this much finer sense of like granularity to the potential outcomes. So with that in mind, tasks do have this kind of marginal outcomes or potential for marginal outcomes, and like critical failures and critical successes and stuff, whereas a check doesn't have the ability to crit. It is just pass or fail. A natural 20 would be an automatic pass, and a natural 1 would be an automatic fail, regardless of the difficulty of the check and how many things you add to it. But apart from that, it's a binary outcome with a check. And the reason I want to use d20s and d10s is because I prefer the maths of that. I think it's really neat and tidy to think in sort of intervals of 5 or 10%. Every tick on a d20 is basically plus 5%. On a d10, it's 10%. And that makes kind of judging how difficult or how easy something is going to be before you roll the dice is a lot easier. I did think about using d6s, and part of me would still like to use d6s because d6s are the least proprietary dice in existence. They're basically just cubes, and so anyone can make a d6 out of like wood or whatever if they're lacking everything else. And maybe there is a version of this system out there that works on d6s, but I'm not making it. So I think I would rather trade the increments of 5 or 10% rather than 16.6 recurring percent with a d6. I think that proprietary element, very minor proprietary element, is worth the sacrifice, especially since most people that play role-playing games regularly have a set of have more than just d6s. That most people that play role-playing games have a d20, and if they've played certain other games, then they will probably already have quite a few d10s as well. So there's a few other little things about making the maths easier as well. So I want to always do addition, never subtraction. So a bonus will always add to your roll or to your dice, and penalties will always add to the difficulty, rather than worrying about, a bonus and a penalty giving you, a +3 and then a -5, so it's a -2 overall, and that kind of maths is tedious, if nothing else. It's not difficult, but it gets in the way, and I don't want to worry about that kind of nitty-grittiness. The only exception to this would be exceptional powers or abilities that sort of break that heuristic of always add. Similarly, division is difficult, so I'm never going to ask a player or a GM probably to do a division in actual gameplay. There are a few divisions that are required during character creation, but in those cases, if you end up with a fraction, always round down. So this game works solely using integers. Another important thing particularly when you're using tasks in this game, but to some degree this also applies with checks, is to always set your stakes and to be really clear about what the failure conditions are before a player rolls the dice. There's a lot of talk on the internet, a lot of advice about failing forwards, which I like, but I find in practice is not always applicable. So I want to spend some time talking about failing better, where failure doesn't necessarily create a dead end unless it is appropriate for it to do that. Sometimes dead ends are interesting. So yeah, I'll save that rant for now, but I have a lot of thoughts about failing in role-playing games, and I think there's a lot of really good advice out there, but it's sort of interspersed with some well-intentioned but perhaps poorly worded advice. So I want to try and separate that out and really hit the nail on the head with that. As part of that, I want players to be able to offer failure solutions, meaning that in the same way that in other games when you succeed, sometimes the GM will offer to the player, how do you want to do this? How do you want to describe your success? Through my own play, through my experiences and discussions with my own players, I have found that there is also a lot of fun in players describing their own failures as well. So I want to talk about that too. And another part about sort of establishing failure conditions before the roll is that it avoids that situation where you just try again if you fail, because you've established that regardless of whether you succeed or fail at the current task, the situation will change such that just trying again straight away isn't viable. Or if you want to try again, you'll have to change the situation in some other way first to get back to that position where you can try again. I'm also playing with some new sort of general game terms. I've never liked the word DM for Dungeon Master in the world's most popular role-playing game. I think referee is an acceptable term, but I most commonly default to GM, which has traditionally meant Game Master. But I'm toying with the idea of it meaning Game Moderator instead. Or perhaps if we do use DM, it would be Director Manager. But there's a second game concept that I want to introduce, and I feel that if this game is going to have any wider legacy beyond my own enjoyment of this game. If there's one thing that I want to see catch on to other systems, it's the idea of the jury. The jury is a relative term where each player has their own jury, and it is all the other players at the table apart from them, which means that each player has a different jury, including the GM, or the judge, as I'm tentatively calling the GM at the moment. The concept of the jury is one that I've been playing with for a long time, but have never really put well into writing. It's, as I said, a relative term, but it allows for much more collaboration at the table. It removes GM fiat by opening it up, opening questions about the rules or about the narrative to everyone who's invested in the game. This means that every player is, to some degree, responsible for adjudicating the rules of the game, not just the GM or the judge. That means that, yeah, anyone can change the rules of this game at any time, but only with the permission of that player's jury. Would have to decide for each table, probably, whether you think a simple majority is required, or a unanimous vote, or a supermajority, or whether you just want to have a discussion and then see if you can come to some kind of conclusion. Despite the use of the judge and jury words here, I don't want it to get too rules lawyery, for lack of a better word. But I do think it's useful to be able to have those conversations, even right in the middle of play. Another thing that I've found through play is when a player can direct their own scenes. When a player can say, hey, can I get a scene with my friend? I want to talk to them about such and such. That is something that I want to encourage, that I see very few other games encouraging. And the best way to encourage something is to reward it. So there's a meta currency that I'm playing around with called Ego, which I would probably reward players with for asking for their own scenes. So another thing that I like the idea of is the GM never rolling dice, or at least rolling as few dice as possible. I think the main reason for this is that because the mechanics ultimately serve to present interesting choices to players, we're less interested in seeing the mechanical drum beat when the players aren't directly involved. So anything that removes kind of the minutiae from anything that the GM has to do because they're already doing so many other things is a good thing in my mind. So I want to write the system in a way such that, yeah, the GM can make as few dice rolls as possible and engage as little as possible with the same mechanics that the players use. Making simplifications and so on and so forth so that the GM can do what they need to do as easily as possible, basically. That stance may be ringing alarm bells for some of you, depending on what your feelings are about sort of simulationism versus narrativism or whatever. I don't really want to get into that kind of conversation, and I don't think it's useful. I think what is a better way of talking about that is just your common sense gameplay versus suspension of disbelief. At the end of the day, like, I know that every GM wants their world to be incredibly rich and diverse and in-depth. You want a world where you can turn down every street corner and there'll be something interesting or unique for the players to discover. But ultimately that's exhausting, and you need some realistic expectations. So anything that can make sense in the game without breaking suspension of disbelief is a good thing. And anything that can kind of make that easier for the players to kind of buy into, whilst also respecting that you're just a human being as the GM, and you need to be given that space to create new gameplay if the players go somewhere that you weren't expecting them to go or something. So yeah, this is another conversation for a later date, but I think there's a lot to be said on this topic at some point. But then the last little thing, sort of, this probably should have been up with the math stuff, but this is no half measures, or there's no maybe option, as I like to put it. The idea for this kind of came from such a weird place, but yeah, I was filling out a survey once, and the options, it was one of those surveys where it's like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about blah, blah, blah? Every single question was, on a scale of 1 to 5, rate your experience, basically. And I basically found myself putting a 3 or a maybe. You know, how strongly do you disagree or agree with this? And it's sort of, I wound up sitting in the middle of the road all the way down the survey, and I just thought, that's very weird. You should write surveys that discourage that kind of behavior on the part of the surveyee, right? And for some reason that thought has stuck with me for a long time, and it has now made it into this game in the form of, basically, when categorizing anything, weights, lengths, durations, age, I want something simple, but where you actually have to make a choice instead of just sitting in the middle of the road. So yeah, lengths are very short, long, or very long. There's no medium length. Difficulties are very easy, hard, or very hard. And I might give these more interesting names than just very X, Y, very Y. But yeah, ultimately, I think it's useful to kind of have just ranks that go from 1 to 4, or in extreme cases from 0 to 5. So in the case of age, I think I've written 0 would be infant, young is 1, adult 2, aged 3, elder 4, and senescent 5. But the sort of 1 to 4 range is your sort of expected bracket or whatever. Again, that kind of comes back to the first point about, trying to force the players to make interesting choices. Maybe is not an interesting decision. It's a non-decision. So yeah. So there's a lot more to this outline, but a lot of this is also stuff that's still very much sort of work in progress, and that won't be kind of easily explainable until I've written it out more thoroughly. But I will just give a very quick overview. So this is just about character assembly, and I want to use some kind of metaphor for character creation, and I'm currently liking the word assembly because it kind of has this implication that the character is built out of lots of little pieces that come together to make something greater than the sum of their parts. I think I'm also trying to work in some kind of sewing or weaving metaphor as well, where your character is like a tapestry and you're putting in different threads and colors and drawing life from different spools or something. I'm working out what terminology to use, but I'm having a bit of fun with the wordplay. There's what I'm calling tiers, which is basically like your starting power level that you choose. And this kind of sets your base pool for points distribution. But then your age also affects your points distribution and the number of strands, which are your sort of life paths that you can take. And this means that you can have like a very old bronze tier character, or you can have a very young gold tier character, and they're both like interesting to play and vastly different power levels. So that comes back around to the sort of versatility aspect. The strands themselves, I want them to be quite simple. Each will have 9 different attributes on it that you can take. And when you take one, you'll also roll a d10 and you'll get one of those 9 for free on top of the whatever else you choose. Just because I do like a bit of randomness during character creation, but not too much so that all of the decisions get made for you. I like when randomness forces you to think about why fate has made that decision for you, rather than and trying to justify that retroactively, rather than when randomness sort of just makes all of the decisions for you and you don't get to have any of the fun. Taking the strands will give you what I'm calling caps, which are, it's a fun little acronym. It's just character attribution points. And so you spend your caps on attributes, which include skills, which are your verbs, features, which are your character's adjectives, so the things that describe them, whereas skills are the things that they can do. And then knacks are their nouns, which are their things that they know a lot about, or things that they have certain trainings or expertise in. In addition to nouns, there are also their proper nouns, their kith and kin, or their VNPCs, that is, very important NPCs. This is something that I've found in other games I've run, where you introduce an NPC and the players don't care about them. But then it is revealed through time or just through circumstance that an NPC that you introduced ends up being really important, and you want to see them more often, or the players want to see them more often. Using the VNPCs system or subsystem, players can designate NPCs that they're really interested in. And similarly, if they find that they thought that they really cared about a certain NPC, but circumstances have meant that they just aren't finding a way to work into scenes, or they've been left behind somewhere, then they can be taken off of that pedestal. They're still a living, healthy NPC in the world, but hopefully. But by designating an NPC as a VinPC, you can say, I really care about this character and I want to see them more in our game. Yeah, I think it's a cool idea. I'm not the first designer to ever add, important relationships to your character, but I think I'm the first one to say you can change your mind, or you don't have to think of one right away, and you can just play the game and see which characters you like before saying, oh yeah, I wanna keep my eye on them or something, But there is a limit. You're only allowed 3, so there's a sort of prioritization calculation that a player has to do as well, which is interesting. Gear. I used to be much more interested in gear and tactical precision and really accurately depicting historical weapons and stuff. I don't really care about that anymore. So I'm going to try and simplify gear as much as possible, but I might write an optional system, tentatively called Mars, as opposed to Venus, where I go into more depth about weapons and stuff. But at the end of the day, I don't actually play that much combat anymore, or I don't run that much combat anymore in my games. But I want the system to handle combat when it needs to. Then there are stats, which is something of a more complicated subsystem, so I won't get into that fully for now, but basically it's a way to modularize your experience based on the tone of the game that you want to set. So actually kind of similar to VinPCs, but with a different mechanic that you derive when you want to add it to your system. So you say, we're going to run a game about, horror. We're going to have a lot of horror themes in our game. So we're going to use this vigilance stat, which represents your sort of mental resilience to abnormal events and existential dread. And then we'll have fun in our spooky setting. But then if the game tone shifts, either if players decide that they're not really into the tone anymore and they want to, move on, or if, they succeed at overcoming the current arc or campaign, and want to sort of go back to a normal life after their terrible experiences, then it's possible that something like wealth or honor, if they're in sort of a feudal society, might be more immediately useful than caring about vigilance anymore. So stats make it easy to kind of swap these things out because they're derived from some of your other abilities, and also by answering a little questionnaire every time you derive them. And the nice thing about that is that if the game's tone then changes back, you have a few sessions in your home village, you can, go and meet all the NPCs and catch up on the gossip and whatever else. And then you go back into the scary world and you need to use your vigilance again. You'll answer the questionnaire again and you'll potentially have different answers. Maybe your opinions or experiences will have changed. So I think that's a neat little thing to be able to do. And then lastly, there's this metacurrency system, which loosely ties into a sort of just a character customization, or what would you even call it? A character uniqueifier, where, you just have some space to write about your character. What do they believe in? What do they want to achieve? What sort of stuff do they do? Almost by instinct. In certain situations, or this part needs more development for sure right now. But the idea is to basically reward players with this meta currency called lots and ego, which they'll be able to spend during sessions on their checks or their tasks to effectively improve their chances of succeeding when they are in these like high narrative stake scenarios. But I've played in other games that have a meta currency system similar to this, where you end up with sort of this bloated amount of currency that you'll never run out of. If you start earning too much of it, if the GM is either too lax with how much they give out, or if the players are just really skilled or really lucky or both, then they can wind up in scenarios where they've just got dozens and dozens of this currency that they're never spending, or that they rarely need to spend. And it just stacks up. So two ways I've thought of to reduce the bloat is to have the more powerful of the two currencies, the ego, to be something that you either have at any given time or you don't have. Once you've spent your ego, that's it. You have to do whatever it is you need to do to recover it, which is currently to like introduce your own scenes. But once you've spent your ego, it's gone. With the lots, I'm putting a limit of 10 that you can have at any one time, meaning that, once you're at 10, or as you're approaching 10, you'll start to think like, when can I spend this? I need to find opportunities to spend this before I hit that limit. But if you do hit that limit, there's still maybe a benefit to staying at that limit, because anything above 10, I would allow you to convert into experience points, so that you're getting rewarded for your gameplay, regardless of how you actually spend your lots or how many opportunities you have to spend. And then lastly, there's a few ideas about sort of what would skills look like, how would you level them up. I'm currently saying that, like, to level up a skill, you need to get twice the number of failed tasks to level it up, equal to the level. So if you're level 4, then you need 8 failures to become level 5. And the reason I like that is because it's sort of like, you only learn from your mistakes, right? You make the mistake, you learn from the mistake, and you keep on moving. I really don't think there's any other way to learn, apart from like, serious slow study, which would happen during downtime, or would happen by spending your excess lots. But like, that's not really what the most role-playing games are about. Most role-playing games are about sort of being in the action and learning in the moment, and having fun as you fall over along the way. Thinking about, what would features look like? What would knacks look like? And then what are some potential additional subsystems that I could design? And when I think about games as a whole from a much more narrative perspective, I think about like how everything that you can throw at a player basically just requires some different kind of conflict resolution. And so what kinds of conflicts can a character encounter that are actually interesting to want to resolve with a more complicated mechanic than just a single dice roll? So I'm thinking about internal conflicts, so things like healing, like healing wounds, or changing your mind, which is an interesting thing that I'm gonna think about. Haven't got fully developed thoughts on that yet, but it would be kind of cool if there's a mechanic for a character to kind of work out what they really believe. Similarly, I want there to be like potential for problems that can't be solved with just your character sheet. So you can't just like look at your character sheet, look at all your stats and skills and be like, I want to use this. Because I've encountered so many situations where a player will tell me first and foremost what skill they want to use before telling me what they even are doing. So I want to try and curb that behavior somehow. And there's some discussion to be had about like how much of the game is player skill versus how much is character skill. Like when you roleplay, when you narrate or talk as your character, like that is a player skill. You need to be like not nervous and kind of good at improv, and like how much should that be rewarded versus the player who wants to speak much more passively or in a different tense, or doesn't want to do the accent. Like I don't think that those players should be punished for role-playing in their own way, right? And similarly, like battle systems rely on player skill as well. Some players are more tactical than others. Some players just have a better grasp of the mechanics and know how to exploit them better than others. So there's a fine balance to be struck there, and it'll definitely require some more thinking for now. But yeah, other things is like, inter-character conflicts, so, fights and chases and possibly debates as well. I'm really interested in the concept in other games of like social combat systems, although I think that's a terrible word for them. They're debates, and they're a lot of fun. They're not for everyone, but I quite like them. Similarly, environmental conflicts, fighting animals or climbing snowy mountains or overcoming, natural disasters, dealing with visibility levels and stuff like that. Supernatural conflicts of religion, both internal and external, dealing with magic or technology, and then larger societal conflicts, so things like war and politics. These are potentially very heavy topics, but they're things that role-playing games are like uniquely positioned to be able to explore in like an interesting, fun, and safe space. Yeah. So this is Venus. This is the beginnings of Evening Star. So yeah, I hope you'll join me on this journey and see where this game goes. Once my sort of early builds and playtests are done and I open it up to more public playtests, I hope you'll engage and try out the game and see if you like it. And if you really like it, then I hope that when the game releases properly, that you'll think about contributing to the game and maybe even publishing some of your own stuff for this system. Because I think, once I've got my version of the game that I want to play done, to some degree or another, the success or failure of this system will live or die on its community. So I want to try and build up a good community around this game if I can. And if you would like to support me along the way as I build out this concept and build it up into a full game, then I've linked my Patreon in the description. It's $5 a month, and it will basically serve as a tip or an encouragement from you to me to keep on working on the game. There's very little that I can really offer right now, in addition to what I'm already offering, considering that I'm planning on releasing the whole game for free. Anyway, it's not like you're gonna be buying an early copy of the game necessarily, but yeah, it depends on how much interest there is. But for now, I'm just going to leave the Patreon as like a tip jar or a monthly encouraging, here you go. If you don't want to support me on a monthly basis, then I've also linked my PayPal donation link and an Ethereum address if you want to send me cryptocurrencies. But yeah, basically I think just there's a lot of work to be done on this game, and I'm hoping to do a lot of that work fairly quickly over the next few months. And I'm gonna do this work like kind of regardless of whether anybody else cares or not. Yeah, if it sounds interesting to you, then hit that subscribe button, because I'll be, like I said, hoping to put out weekly videos or live streams about my development on this. And if you want to support this in some other way but you don't have any money, then just like the video or share it with someone else who you think might be interested in this, because that's really the only other way that you can help me. Oh yeah, or just comment comment below if you have any other ideas or suggestions. Then absolutely comment, let me know. Just be aware that anything that you write as a suggestion for what could or might be in the game, I may add without crediting you, just because the game is in these like early stages. But once the game's more kind of openly available, it should be easier to credit people via like GitHub pull requests and stuff. But anyway, that's a bit further ahead. So I'm starting to ramble at this point, so I'll wrap it up there. So thank you for watching and or listening, and wish me luck.